After nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing that we need most in the world. Philip Pullman. Every country and culture has stories. As long as we've been a species, we've made up stories. They've been used as a tool to cope with the unknown, as well as used to explain beauty, fear, excitement, and confusion in the world and in our experiences as individuals. In many cases, they have been used to spark a movement or a revolution. Stories, as a writer, can give people the courage to speak their mind and bring forth important issues. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was one of these revolutionary writers. Gilman used her writing to explore the role of women in America at the time. She explored issues such as the lack of a life outside the home and oppressive forces of the patriarchal society. Gilman explained that the idea for the story The Yellow Wallpaper originated in her own experience as a patient. The real purpose of the story was to reach Dr. Weir Mitchell and convince him of the error of his ways. She had suffered years of depression and consulted Dr. Mitchell, who was a specialist physician who prescribed the rest cure, which required her to live as domestic a life as possible. She was forbidden to read or write and only allowed 2 hours of mental stimulation a day. In The Yellow Wallpaper, Gilman portrays the narrator's insanity as a way to protest the medical and professional oppression against women at the time. The story details the main character's descent into madness. In the story, the narrator and her husband have a baby. Her husband, John, after seeing the narrator suffering from depression, believes that it is in her best interest to go on the rest cure by staying in bed for an entire summer. The narrator is against this. She even expresses her disinterest in the treatment by stating, "So I take phosphates or phosphites, whichever it is, in tonics and journeys and air and exercise, and am absolutely forbidden to work until I am well again. Personally, I disagree with their ideas." The family spends the summer in a colonial mansion that has, in the narrator's words, something queer about it. She is confined to an upstairs room that has barred windows, torn wallpaper, and scratched floors. She comes to suspect that another woman was once confined there against her will, just as she is. The reader is left unsure as to whether the damage in the room has been caused by a previous occupant or by the narrator herself. At one point, for example, the narrator bites the wooden bedstead. The narrator devotes many journal entries to describing the wallpaper in the room, its yellow smell, its breakneck pattern, its missing patches, and the way it leaves a yellow smears on the skin and clothing of anyone who touches it. She describes how the longer she stays in the room, the more the wallpaper appears to mutate, especially in the moonlight. With no stimuli other than the wallpaper, the pattern and design become increasingly intriguing to the narrator. She soon begins to see a figure in the design and eventually comes to believe that a woman is creeping on all fours behind the pattern. She believes she must try and free the woman in the wallpaper and strips the wallpaper off the wall. On the last day of summer, she locks herself in her room to strip the remains of the wallpaper. When her husband arrives home, she refuses to unlock the door. When he returns with the key, he finds her creeping around the room, circling the walls and touching the wallpaper. She exclaims, "I've got out at last," and her husband faints as she continues to circle the room, stepping over his inert body each time she passes, and the story ends. While under the impression that husbands and male doctors were acting with their best interests in mind, women were depicted as mentally weak and fragile. At the time, women's rights advocates believed that the outbreak of women being diagnosed as mentally ill was the manifestation of their setbacks regarding the roles they were allowed to play in a male-dominated society. Charlotte Perkins Gilman realized that writing became one of the only forms of existence for women at the time where they had very few rights. She had known this from personal experience. The wallpaper is considered an important piece of feminist literature and aided the movement for better mental health for women. In an article Gilman published in 1913 titled "Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper," she goes on to say how writing this story kept her from going crazy while resting. Many publishers asked her why she would ever write such a horrid story to begin with, to which she replied, "It was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy," and it worked. She needed to write this story in order to survive. While this is a single story that supports the quote by Philip Pullman, it is a perfect example of how important stories in literature can be for someone who feels isolated and desires an outlet for their feelings. she wrote about what so many women of the time were feeling.